And Kyle, I mentioned this to you before when we talked about talking about the subject, that fasting seems like the subject matter of fasting. It seems intense. It seems radical, but it's really not radical. It's just that so much of biblical Christianity only looks radical in today's times.
Yeah.
But it's just a really biblical thing to do, to fast. So I can run through these. These things I have written down. And like I said, we don't have time probably because we probably don't have time to chase down all these references. But these are some maybe things we can revisit and then just we can make comments on it as we kind of shut this thing down.
Yeah.
But I just wrote down these 7 proofs. Why 7? Well, just because 7 proofs why we should be fasting, the proofs in the New Testament. Okay. The first thing I had written down was, like Jesse mentioned, is it's how Paul's first missionary journey started. Acts 13. Okay. So it's how that thing started. Okay. Paul's a big deal. He's the apostle to the church. He's the guy that we follow as he followed Christ. He gave us our church age doctrine. So much. I mean, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, that shouldn't even be a thing that needs explaining. All right. Second thing I have written down is it's how Jesus started his earthly ministry. Interesting thing. Okay. He fasts for 40 days there when he's being tempted of the devil in Matthew 4 before he ever even starts preaching and doing that deal. So interesting thing. And it's interesting even saying that because it's like, it's easy to have the cop-out thing with Jesus. Like, well, Jesus is God, so, whatever. But I do think we forget about the fact that, we forget about the humanity aspect of Christ. Okay, was Christ 100% God? Of course he was. But we lose the sight that he was also 100% man. He felt every ounce of struggle and whatever and pain that we would feel in a fast. Okay, he felt that because he was 100% man. So it's interesting he started his earthly ministry that way. The third thing I have written down is that Paul this is a weird one, but run the references, it's there. Paul gives it as a recommendation, as something to do, as one of the few things to do when you're abstaining from your spouse. Okay, so it's a weird reference, but 1 Corinthians 7:5, Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 7, he's talking about literally, go read the chapter. If you're like, as the listener, go read it. Don't take my word for it. But that if you are going to abstain from sexual relations with your spouse for a time, he's warning you that you can be tempted elsewhere if you do that. But he says that to do that, if it's given to prayer and fasting. So it's a weird reference, but but nonetheless, Paul is still giving it as a recommendation. And so that's the church age epistle right down the middle of the plate for us. All right. Now we'll let Jesse explain more on the abstinence thing on another episode and just how to. All right. All right. The next thing is that it's connected with decision making. Acts 14. So the very next chapter after Paul was sent out. Okay. And really Acts 13 goes along with that too. And another thing I have written down is, and this is big. Kyle, do you want to go here? Do you want to go to Matthew 6? Like, this is worth reading. Like I said, we don't have time for the references, and we don't. But this one's worth reading. Matthew 6, verse 16 and 17. And I just wrote down that Christ says, when ye fast. So he doesn't say if. He doesn't use it as like a maybe if you decide to do this. It's almost like he's implying that it's going to happen at some point. You're supposed to,
Yeah. Matthew 6:16. Moreover, when ye fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face.
All right, so it's interesting. So now what someone could say is, Dylan, that's the Sermon on the Mount. That has nothing to do with the church. Okay, that's fine. But he also, in that same chapter, says, when you pray. Okay. Yeah. So, like, he's assuming that prayer will be a thing for a believer. And, I mean, my gosh, like, I don't think in anything in this, we're not using this episode at any point to convince you to pray, because we're assuming you caring enough to click on a Bible podcast that you already know you should probably pray. All right. But there's a chance that you probably doubt that you should fast. But he uses the same verbiage in Matthew 6. He says, when you pray, And then he also says, when you fast. And so interesting words that Christ uses there. All right. Another one is that Christ says that after he's gone, the apostles should give themselves to fasting. So it's Matthew 9, verse 14 and 15. We won't go there. But it's when I think it's the Pharisees come up to Christ and they're questioning things because they're like, why do your disciples not fast when John the Baptist and his boys were always fasting? And that's a pretty fair question. Like, they noticed that. And in other words, Christ says, hey, when the bridegroom's here, there's no need to fast, but when I'm gone, they can fast. And so, I mean, it's not real deep, but the church age follows when Christ was no longer here. Like he was on the earth for 3.5 years. He died, was buried, and resurrected. And then you have the transition of Acts into the church age. So, pretty good argument that Christ is obviously physically no longer here. We are his physical body, but he himself is not. So it's a good time to fast. All right. And then lastly, and this is kind of the main thing that you think about, but a New Testament proof on why we should fast is that it brings spiritual victory. And it's the Matthew 17 reference I just mentioned in Mark chapter 9. It gives help with strongholds. It gives help with even spiritual warfare. And a lot of times people don't like to think about the spiritual warfare aspect of things because we live in such a, we think that that's almost like a thing of the past. But the spiritual realm is very real and very active today. And we can have victory over those kind of things, strongholds, besetting sins, whatever it is. Fasting can help break through for those kind of things. So those are just 7 things that, like I said, all are New Testament references. Like I said, just for the kind of like Jesse mentioned earlier, there's probably a lot of people that think, oh yeah, that was, they used to do that, but that's not really a thing today. Well, I think biblically we can make an argument that it is. So,
I think an important reference